The Art of Yes. Interview with Jeff Michalski. Hello, Jeff. Today,
Hello.
my guest is Jeff Michalski, which is in Polish, and I have to say that today. Michalski, Jeff Michalski. Dzień dobry.
Dzień dobry. Pani.
Yay! Dzień dobry
Yeah.
panu. Hello, Jeff. How are you?
Hi. I'm very good. And how are you doing?
I'm fine. I'm so excited to have this wonderful possibility to talk to you.
Well, thank you so much. It's late there, right?
Yeah, pretty late, but it's 9 o'clock, so it's not very.
Okay. Not bad. Okay.
It's evening.
Mhm.
Jeff, so good to see you. We've met recently, just on the meeting with Joe Bill in one of his meetings. I never had such a great chance to talk to you, and now is the time that I can discover more about you. I would like to
Thank you.
talk about improv, but I would start with a little bit of what we already started. You have a Polish roots, and I'm really
Yeah.
interested where it comes from.
Well, it comes from my grandparents on my father's side were both Polish immigrants. And is Galicia sound right for southwestern Poland?
Silesia, yes, Śląsk.
Yeah. Okay. So they're from there. They moved to Chicago, and then they had a bunch of children, like really a dozen, but only 9 survived.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I grew up in what's a Polish neighborhood in the north side of Chicago. Went to the parish of St. Stanislaus Kuska, which is the oldest Polish church in Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
And it was across the street from a park called Pulaski Park. And the public school in the neighborhood was Kosciuszko. So obviously this area of Chicago was settled by Polish immigrants. And so most of the people around where I lived, not exactly where I lived, but my neighborhood, were Polish speaking families, mothers, the kids. The nuns spoke Polish at our parish. And the assumption was that everybody spoke Polish, but not me. So I think that helped with my comedy, because it's that miscommunication and things like that lead to laughter.
And also pretending that you understand.
Pretending that I understand, yeah, because I did pretend. After a while, it was pointless for me to constantly go, I don't speak Polish, and then shake their head at me and wave their finger about what's with your parents, so. But my dad didn't speak Polish, he did, but not in our household. And that was also a thing for not just our community, but other immigrant communities, where parents stop speaking their native tongue so that their children get used to speaking in English and the like. So I was there, but I was an outsider because I didn't speak the language. And I was funny because of that, because people would laugh at my antics in trying to communicate. Or not. Trying to guess what people are arguing about is really a fun exercise, right?
Yeah.
And in improvisation, they have gibberish, right? Spolin has the gibberish games. Mm-hmm. And she created those specifically because she was running workshops in immigrant communities. And they were, a lot of times, you have Italian immigrants and you have Polish immigrants and you have German immigrants, and they don't speak the same language, but they all have stories from their countries that they can tell, children's stories or And that's where she created gibberish so people could tell those stories in gibberish and you're still communicating what's happening. Mm-hmm. And part of the place, some of the places she taught were not far from my neighborhood. Mm-hmm. There's a place called Eckert Park on Chicago Avenue, and also a Polish community, but moving into Italian, right? And they had these places called settlement houses that she and Neva Boyd, who was her mentor, would teach theater, improvisation, all kinds of stuff. Because Viola was in charge of the entire park district for recreation. So she also was in charge of wood shops and other trade skills and all kinds of different things besides theater. So she has very interesting notes on these things at the University of Northwestern University in the library there. And you get a real good sense of just seeing how deep her approach was. Do you know who Viola Spolin is?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, some people don't. Some people think it starts with Dell, but it doesn't, right?
True. Tell me, because you're coming from Chicago, which is Mecca of improv, but you're not only improviser, you're also an actor. So for me, it's always amazing how this happens in States, because very often it starts with acting and then comes improvisation, or opposite, or sometimes together. How improv and acting found you? When and how you started to do it?
Well, I got a low draft number during the Vietnam era, and in order to avoid going, because they're kind of ratcheting down the war, but it made it more dangerous. So I enlisted in the Navy for my time there. And when I got out, my brother picked me up. And I was a very funny person all the time in the Navy, wherever, it doesn't matter. I was just a funny person. And probably because of the language things. And then for me to try to interpret what people mean, even if you're suddenly thrust into a class system as pronounced as the military. So he picked me up and he drove me to a Joe Forsberg's Second City workshop. And he said, "You belong here." That's what he said, "You belong here." And he just dropped me off. And I went into the class. I watched the first class and I went and saw a show that my brother was in on the weekend. And then I was in the class and it was sort of like I was home. It's like, this is my tribe. I'm home. Not that they understood me, but they laughed at me. So I started performing almost immediately. I didn't wait for somebody to go, "You're ready to perform." I started going to coffee shops with people and improvising right away. And because it was all new to me, whatever I was learning, I was putting right back the skill, not the game, the skill I was putting into practice in front of an audience almost immediately. And and I went to Columbia College with my GI Bill, and my major, if you want to call it that, was writing, but I also took a lot of the theater classes too. And the teachers were, David Mamet was a teacher there, and Michael Cullen, who was a guy that ran a thing called the Travel Light Theater Company. Columbia College hired professionals to teach for their film departments and for their theater departments and their writing departments. And that was both good and bad. The good was that you're meeting professionals and you're getting an education from them. The bad part was that they weren't in class very often because they were working, right? So you had a lot of time where you just came to class and there's no teacher there. And so that was a little bit frustrating. That's why I majored in writing, because the writing teachers were more likely to be there than the acting teachers. And they used a style that was related to story theater, which is Paul Sills, Viola's son, did a thing called Story Theater, and the writing department, this guy named Charles Schultz or John Schultz, and he was from the University of Iowa, and they used a kind of communal storytelling to help you learn to write. And so that was interesting. I mean, all these things all have the same roots for me. That's the other thing that happened, is these things all had the same roots. The first show I did was directed by, what was his name? Anyway, he was the head of the San Francisco Mime Troupe. And they also used parts of story theater to do their shows. And the other director was a woman named Fritzi Solins, who was Bernie Solins' first wife. So right from the beginning, I was inundated with one form or another of Spolin. Even the music, there's a guy named William Russo who was in the music department at Columbia, and he would do these rock operas. It's called the Free Theater, but he had been a partner of Paul Sills at the, these are things I didn't know at the time, but he was a partner with Paul Sills at the Victory Gardens Theater. So I remember wandering in as a young hippie to this workshop as I was walking down the street, because I heard a song I liked, and it was Russo's workshop, and they were doing improvisation, but through music. So all that stuff was happening for me simultaneously. And I didn't have to jump over a bar to participate, like you do with theater, right? I did theater, but it was much easier for me to start engaging performance through improvisation. And then really it's my connections through Jo Forsberg, who was Viola's assistant, and she ran her own classes. For a while, the only classes in Chicago. There were no Dell classes at the time, just on and off. And Bill Murray went to her class. And a lot of famous people were in her class first. So she would post auditions, or she would produce shows, plays, and we would do the plays. So mostly everything I learned about theater in the beginning was from her, because she taught Spolin, but she also taught Stanislavski. She had a hybrid approach, and also pop psychology stuff too. So there's all that in there. And but it was hands-on. So you would learn how to run lights, how to hang lights, how to write a running order, all kinds of things that are contingent that you need to put up a show. So it was great. And I took Dell's class too when he was in town. So I bumped between those two. She gave you the more solid theatrical approach. And Dell gave you great stuff, but it was more, in a sense, about pleasing him for students. So it was very competitive for no reason. And improvisation, basically, to do ensemble work, you have to avoid the competition or conflict. Even if there's conflict in a scene, you're cooperating in establishing that you agree to this conflict, right? So otherwise the scene goes nowhere.
So tell me, what young Jeff was struggling with, because improvisation is not a thing we learn in one day. So what did you find at the beginning of your improv adventure difficult for yeah. Was it difficult?
Almost, this is going to sound weird, but almost nothing.
Oh, that's good.
It was sort of like I landed in my pond. Later on, I did struggle with expanding my education, especially when I got to Second City. because if you were caught flat-footed on an audience suggestion, and Chicago, you know, the roots for improvisation in Chicago are the University of Chicago. So the audiences you got earlier on at Second City were very intelligent, and they would tell you play to at least the intelligence of the audience. So that meant that there were times I was faced with, in front of an audience, faced with having a suggestion that I knew nothing about. And what I did at Second City was primarily, if I came up blank, I would read 3-4 books on whatever it was, so that never happened again. So that became a kind of a continuing education for me, too, and more liberal arts than what I was getting at Columbia College, because it's a specialty school, so you didn't take a lot of math and science there, right?
So did you think at that time that the language of the performing, like of the show, had to be, you know, like intellectual or something like that?
It's not that it has to be; it needs to be. You have to be at least as intelligent as your audience. You have to assume that they know more than you do. So if you don't know, you should. And it's not about it being intellectual. It's about breaking down language for communication. It's about deconstruction, so that whatever you say to me has meaning. And the more that I know, the more opportunity for meaning to emerge from what you say to me, especially if I'm able to deconstruct what you're saying. And I don't have to deconstruct it accurately. It's more of taking something that you said and deconstructing it so that you have multiple pathways to go down. So if you use the word chair in a sentence early in a scene, I would deconstruct chair. So what does chair mean to me? It's a place to rest. It's a place of execution. It's the head of an educational department, right? So I can now deconstruct that and use any of that either for the location, the relationship, or what the scene is about. And it doesn't matter that you were just talking about a chair. It's now expanded into multiple pathways that we can go down. So those are the things I learned at Second City, is the making the scene about something. Because we can have a minor exchange in a scene about pie or, you know, food or what we're eating, and that's a transaction. And there's nothing to be, almost nothing to be learned in a transaction. It's like, I buy the cigarettes. Here's your money. Bye. See you later. Hey. Yeah. But if the scene is about tobacco or smoking or addiction, now the scene's about something.
So this approach of Second City is like coming from the work of everyone?
It started with David Shepard and Paul Sills, and at the Compass Theater, which was just across the street from the University of Chicago. So they were at cross purposes. Paul was using improvisation in a theatrical context. So he would take a play and do the play, but the rehearsal for the play would consist of improvisation and even some improvisation techniques within the play. So he would do the chalk circle, for instance, as story theater. So when they moved, David felt that improvisation could stand on its own because he'd watch the rehearsals and go, wow, this is really fun. So they did viola games in rehearsal, mostly at the Compass. And what they did on stage is that somebody would write a scenario, like Elaine May would write a scenario, and she'd bring it in. And they'd tack up the scenario backstage, and the actors would look at the scenes broken down. no dialogue in the scenes, just a description of what happens.
Mm-hmm.
And they would improvise a one-act play, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So David wanted it to be a theater of the proletariat. He wanted the working class to be doing theater, basically. And so he'd bring in like truck drivers, a group of truck drivers and this and that, and to do improvisation, but they could only do the games, right? And because they weren't there to do anything else. And he wasn't getting traction on it because working people work, right? I mean, it's like I'm a working class person, but in order to do improvisation, I had to be poor. I had to choose to be poor until a certain point when people started paying me to do comedy. So it was a middle class endeavor. And there are people that would tell you later on that satire is in itself a middle class endeavor, in that it's the middle class that has time to reflect on what's happening. They're not in survival mode. So they can sit back and go, what's happening? What's happening with the government? What's happening with this? What's happening with that? What's going on here? And because you have that opportunity, it by its nature became a middle class endeavor. So Paul's thing kind of won out because people like Elaine May, Mike Nichols, were serious about discovery and that Spolin theme. And Spolin is all about discovery. It's all about reflection. It's not about those games. Those games are just catalysts to show you how to approach improvisation. They're not, people do game shows, Spolin game shows, but that's not the point. The point is that you develop a skill in that game, and now you incorporate that skill into improvisation. And that's what the people end up doing in the Compass Theater. And then at a certain point, Paul, Bernie Salins, and Howard Elk, who was Bob Dylan's chroniclist, he did a couple of those movies that Dylan did, opened up the Second City. And they, instead of doing scenarios, one acts, they started doing scenes, individual scenes in it. But their thing was for it to be satirical. And what satire is how your behavior differs from your ideals. Like culturally, we can say, oh, Americans are, this is who we are. This is how we see ourselves. But your behavior betrays that. Mm-hmm. And in that behavior switch, that's the comedy. Mm-hmm. It's, that's where the irony lies, is you think you're this way, but your behavior's this way. And you can equate irony with a joke, and that's what Second City did. Mm-hmm. That was their primary function, not anymore, but their function at the time was not to do political humor per se, or not to do intellectual humor, but in discovering how your behavior differs from your ideals, you discover things. The audience and the players discover things at the exact same moment, and that's when you're truly impacting an audience, mm-hmm. in that discovery moment. So a lot of that's lost now because people have made a lot of improvisational training transactional. And it's like, okay, but you're missing the ultimate art and beauty of this when that happens. So Dell used to say that we're poets. And so what he meant by that is that we were reflecting on who we were, where we were, what the plight was. We're reflecting on it. And in that reflection, you create poetry. And in deconstruction period, you create poetry. Because once I say that a chair is a place to rest, that's poetry. So that became more of Second City's approach, Not that everybody was schooled in it. You certainly had a lot of people that were just funny, that were just a virtuoso at some aspect of theater or improvisation and weren't really improvisers. But in a good cast, there are always 2 or 3 really good improvisers in the cast. So you develop that sensibility. If you watch Pasquesi and TJ, their scenes are